What if death wasn't a peaceful release, but a trap? A twisted game where your past mistakes come alive to torment you. Lucy Morgan had always lived a careful life, avoiding the darkness that lay in the corners of her soul. But when her life was abruptly stolen away, she found herself trapped in a world where shadows whispered her deepest regrets, and escape was a haunting riddle.
Lucy Morgan had always been careful. An accountant in her mid-30s, she lived a life of routine, order, and quiet loneliness. Her days were filled with numbers and deadlines, and her nights were spent in front of a flickering television screen or reading a book, never too close to the people she loved, never too close to the parts of herself she feared. She'd lived cautiously until that night.
The accident happened so suddenly, it felt like a violent snap of reality. One moment she was walking home from her office, the streets of the city lit by a cold neon glow. The next, a screech of tires, a blinding light, and then nothing. The world went dark. When Lucy opened her eyes again, she was no longer standing on the bustling street. She wasn't even in her body. She was somewhere else. A fog clung to the air, thick and suffocating. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though it might crumble away at any moment. The sky above was an unnatural shade of purple, the clouds swirling in hypnotic patterns that made her dizzy. It was cold, unnaturally cold. And the silence, the oppressive silence that hung in the air, was almost worse than the cold itself.
"Where am I?"
Lucy whispered, but no one answered. As she took a step forward, the fog seemed to shift, drawing her toward something. Lucy, why did you leave me?" A voice, her mother's, echoed through the void. Lucy froze. Her mother had passed away years ago, but this voice, full of pain and sorrow, was unmistakable. Another voice cut through, sharper, more bitter.
"You never even tried, Lucy, not when it mattered."
Her heart stuttered as the shadows around her seemed to form into figures, faces from her past. Her estranged father, her best friend she had abandoned, the old lover she had never quite let go of. Each one seemed to float just out of reach, their eyes filled with accusation.
"No, I didn't mean to. I didn't want to leave them."
The shadows moved closer, pressing in on her like the weight of the world. The figure from the mist stepped forward once again, its face still hidden but somehow staring directly at her.
"You ran from them, you ran from yourself, and now you must face the cost."
The air around her vibrated with the sound of thousands of voices, all shouting in unison. Her mistakes, her regrets, her unspoken truths. They tore through her like a storm, each one more painful than the last. "Why did you leave her?"
"I didn't mean to. I was scared. I didn't know what to do."
The shadows loomed closer, pushing her back, forcing her to confront every moment she had turned away, every time she had chosen safety over love. The regret suffocated her, pressing against her chest until she couldn't breathe.
"You cannot move on until you have answered, until you have made amends."
But how could she? How could she ever make up for the years of distance? For the love she had neglected, the relationships she had abandoned. She had always been too careful, too scared to open up. And now, in this place, this twisted purgatory, she would pay the price.
"You've been running, Lucy, but it's time to face it."
I don't want to face it. Please make it stop."
But the shadows continued to close in, and the weight of her guilt felt unbearable. The figure's shape began to blur, its form shifting and morphing as it extended a hand toward her.
"Face the truth."
Suddenly, the shadows seemed to pull back, retreating as if they had been swept away by an unseen force. The fog lifted, and Lucy found herself standing in a new place. This time it wasn't dark, it wasn't oppressive. The light was soft, warm, almost comforting. She was no longer surrounded by shadows or voices. Instead, a figure stood before her, her mother. But it was different this time. There was no anger, no bitterness, just an overwhelming sense of peace.
"I'm sorry, Mom. I never should have left. I was afraid, and I'm sorry."
Her mother smiled softly, and for the first time in years, Lucy felt a sense of release. The heavy weight in her chest began to lift. The void that had tormented her seemed to dissolve into light. "Forgive yourself, Lucy. You've been running for too long." As the last whisper faded into nothingness, Lucy felt herself being pulled forward. And this time it wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a punishment. It was a second chance. When Lucy awoke, she was in a sterile white room, the hum of machines filling the silence. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw a doctor standing over her, his face filled with relief.
You're alive. You were gone for over an hour. We didn't think you'd make it.
Lucy didn't speak. She only stared at him, her mind still caught in the place between life and death. But one thing was clear. She had learned something. Death wasn't the end. It was a reckoning, a place where we must face the consequences of our lives. And for Lucy, it was a second chance to live the life she had always been too afraid to face.